Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 6 important articles. There are 4 articles that require a detailed analysis both for your prelims and mains, and 2 small articles that are relevant just for the prelims exam. So let's cover these topics comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are benefiting from our sessions, do support us with your likes, your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also before I start, I would like to remind the 2026 and 2027 aspirants that if you're looking to prepare for the upcoming exam and if you're looking to enroll for our classroom program, you can avail a free counseling session with our mentors just by filling the Google form for which the link is provided in the video description below. Share your details using the Google form and our team will get in touch with you for a free counseling session. So with this, let's get started by looking at the first column from page number 8. This article deals with the topic of climate finance. It helps us understand what is climate finance as defined by the Climate Change Convention, why developed countries have a responsibility to provide climate finance to developing countries, and also what is India's requirement with regard to climate finance. Now, this discussion acquires a lot of significance because in a few days, COP29 summit is all set to be held at Baku in Azerbaijan. The Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention will take place next month, the 29th Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change will be hosted by Azerbaijan in Baku. So all the UN member states will be coming together to find solutions for the problem of climate change and global warming and to come out with a framework to deal with the impact of climate change. So in order to adapt to climate change and mitigate the impact, what we need is adequate finance, especially for developing underdeveloped countries. The developing and underdeveloped countries are more vulnerable and they are less accountable with regard to climate change and global warming because the developed nations are the ones which share the burden of historical responsibilities. Given that developed countries have contributed more to climate change, they have an obligation to help the developing nations and provide climate finance and share even technology with them so that they can move away from fossil fuels and adapt to the impact of climate change, so that they can even adopt cleaner forms of energy, transition to renewable energy, and ensure that they not only adapt but also implement mitigation measures to mitigate the impact of climate change. So this is the important topic that we have to explore through this article. So let's go a little beyond the article and let's take a deep dive into this topic. The first point I would like to explain here is that why are developed countries more responsible as compared to developing countries? What is this divide between the developed and developing world when it comes to climate change and global warming? See, according to the 6th assessment report, which was recently published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the highest authority and the leading think tank that provides the backing for climate science to the Climate Change Convention, published the 6th assessment report recently, and according to the report, developed countries have contributed 57% to the current global warming since 1850. That is, over the last 2 centuries, since the beginning of Industrial Revolution, since we started burning fossil fuels in large quantities, and since we started releasing greenhouse gas emissions, it is the developed world, the industrialized nations, which have primarily contributed to these emissions. They account for a total of 57% of the total emissions. And don't forget, This is at a time when their population is much smaller as compared to the developing, underdeveloped world. So fewer people and few countries have utilized most of the carbon budget that was available. That is how in the first place these countries became developed and industrialized, because they got all the bandwidth to burn as much fossil fuels as needed to develop their economies, to solve their socio-economic and developmental problems and uplift their people. Whereas the majority of the world, which accounts for majority of the global population today, where they are found in developing, underdeveloped nations, from India to other African countries, Latin American countries and other island countries, these countries never had that kind of opportunity. And moreover, they are faced with serious developmental problems. Also, given the impact of colonization, where the Western countries largely looted the wealth and resources from the developing, underdeveloped world, it further affected their developmental status. And post decolonization, these countries of the global south, they have been struggling to solve the problems of poverty, healthcare, education, etc. So these countries have a greater need to burn fossil fuels to provide economic growth, which can provide the space for socio-economic welfare and development. A large part of the world's population has contributed relatively less to global emissions as compared to the developed world. And despite having smaller population, their per capita emissions happens to be much higher as compared to the per capita emissions of the developing, underdeveloped countries. In fact, the lower population in developed countries directly contributes to higher per capita emissions. That shows the extent to which they have burnt fossil fuels and contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. This is what we call as historical emissions. So historically, it is the developed countries and industrialized nations which have primarily contributed to emissions, and accordingly, they are responsible for these emissions. This is what we call as historical responsibilities. So this concept was ingrained into climate change talks, and it was even brought out through the CBDR principle, the common but differentiated responsibilities, under the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, which was the first climate agreement under the Climate Change Convention, it cemented the principle of CBDR, which was championed by developing and underdeveloped countries like India, China, and others. India played a pivotal role to champion this principle of CBDR, which means the goal to fight climate change is a common goal for every country. Every country has to contribute to fight climate change and global warming. But the responsibilities have to be differentiated. The responsibilities that they undertake to fight climate change, global warming, needs to be differentiated based on their historical emissions, based on the extent to which they have contributed to climate change and global warming. And also don't forget, since the developing countries are more vulnerable to the impact of climate change, they need assistance to adapt and even mitigate the consequences of climate change. Because due to climate change, today we are already experiencing extreme weather events, from increased cyclones to heavy rainfall to droughts and heat waves and forest fires. So the global south countries are more affected as they have lesser capabilities to deal with these disasters. Rising sea levels, the melting of glaciers and ice caps poses a bigger threat to small island countries and coastal cities in the global south. So they need assistance, they need finance, they need technology as well to not only transition to cleaner fuels, but also to take up adaptation mitigation measures to guard and protect their vulnerable communities against the impact of extreme weather events. So it's only fair to expect the developed world to contribute more, as they are responsible for historical emissions and they have historical responsibility on them. So this is what has been the key pillar of climate change talks since 1990s. The CBDR principle, common but differentiated responsibilities, it enshrined this principle into climate change talks. Now, as part of climate finance, the developed countries made a big commitment in 2009 through the Copenhagen Accord. When the climate change summit was held in Copenhagen in 2009, through the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, they made a big commitment. They committed $100 billion in climate finance to developing countries. The developed countries made a promise that the global south countries will receive $100 billion in climate finance by 2020. But this target was never met. In fact, the flow of finance never even started properly from developed countries to developing countries. This has now been extended to 2025, and still there hasn't been enough flow of funds from the developed industrialized countries towards the developing underdeveloped countries. But if you look at a report published by OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an economic grouping of developed European countries, this report claims that adequate climate finance is being provided by the developed countries. So this is where the writer of the column raises an objection against this OECD report. This report, brought out by the European economies, claims that they are providing adequate climate finance to the developing countries. But that is not entirely correct. The writer is pointing out that this report is including public finance provided through governments and as well as private finance raised through the private sector, through private investments. And while computing the total flow of funds from developed to developing countries, the report is including not just the grants and concessional loans, but it is also including the commercial loans and other investments which are coming in from developed to developing countries. So this is a big flaw, a big mistake that has been made in the report according to the writers. Because when we say climate finance, if developed countries have to genuinely help and assist the developing countries, and if they have to be held liable for their historical responsibilities, then what should be accounted under climate finance is just the grants and concessional loans. Now let's say a country like Germany provides a grant to Bangladesh, or United States gives a concessional loan to, let's say, a country like Sri Lanka. That is what accounts for climate finance. If that is dedicated for some clean energy project or for some adaptation mitigation project, and if it is in the form of a grant, which is basically aid or free charity by a country, or if it is in the form of concessional loans where the interest rates are lower and the repayment period is flexible, only such finance should be accounted as part of climate finance. They can't include commercial loans and other investments which are coming in. For example, FDI coming in to a certain sector can't be counted as climate finance. Or commercial loans raised by international institutions or through foreign banks can't be seen as climate finance, because here the interest rates are higher. The borrowing country will end up paying the loan entirely. There is no concession given. So how can commercial loans and investments be counted as climate finance? That is not any kind of assistance being provided by developed countries to developing countries. So this is an important point being raised by the global south. From many years, this debate has been going on. So the writers are objecting to the report of OECD, which states that adequate climate finance is flowing, because they are accounting not just grants and concessional loans, which are very minimal. They are even accounting private investments in the equity market, the flow of FDI, commercial loans provided through foreign banks and global financial institutions. So by including everything, they are labeling it as climate finance from developed countries. But that is incorrect. It is not fair. It is not just to account for commercial loans and other investments which don't really help in adaptation and mitigation. So writers are insisting that at the upcoming climate change summit, it should be made very, very clear by the developing countries that developed countries should only account for grants and concessional loans as part of climate finance. So there is an urgent need to increase climate finance to provide more funding so that it can help the global south countries to transition, to adopt clean energy and move away from fossil fuels eventually, to achieve their respective net zero targets. For example, India has committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, whereas developed countries have a much earlier commitment to achieve net zero by 2045-2050. China has committed to achieve net zero by 2060. So according to each country's capabilities and according to each country's historical responsibilities, they have taken up different net zero targets. And to make this transition, the developing, underdeveloped countries, they need finance and as well as access to technology so that they can shift to clean energy, bring down emissions and achieve the net zero state where the overall emissions will be matched with the carbon which is being sequestered. They also need assistance in adaptation and mitigation. Given that climate-linked disasters are already occurring and developing poor countries are more vulnerable, they need help and assistance to adapt to this new reality and try and mitigate or reduce the impact of these climate-linked disasters, especially the island states, the small island states and the coastal cities in the global south. They need the maximum support and assistance as they are the most vulnerable. So this is what the writers are insisting upon. They are insisting that the developed countries which are more responsible, they should be held accountable. They should contribute adequate climate finance as promised under the Copenhagen Accord. They can't include investments and commercial loans and call it climate finance. They should only consider grants and concessional loans which are genuinely helping global south countries to deal with climate change. That is what accounts for climate finance. This is what the Climate Change Convention defines climate finance as. If you look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it defines climate finance as any dedicated funding, be it at the local level or at the state or national level, or be it at the global level. Any funding which is specific to clean energy transition or funding which is specific to adaptation and mitigation, only such funding is considered as part of climate finance. This is how the Climate Change Convention defines climate finance. Other incidental expenses and investments are not considered. Only those funds, be it at the local level, at the level of a city or a village, be it at the level of a province or at the level of a state, that is at the level of a nation, or at the global level, any funding which is going towards making a transition towards clean energy to move away from fossil fuels, any finance which is helping in adaptation and mitigation, only that is to be accounted as climate finance. So OECD and developed countries can't club commercial loans, private investments and other incidental investments as part of climate finance. So coming to India, India has a requirement for climate finance as well. Because as I said, we have announced an ambitious net zero emission target by 2070. Under the Paris Agreement of 2015, India has made some ambitious commitments and we are well on our way to achieve those targets as well. We want to ensure that by 2030, by the end of the decade, we have a installed capacity of renewable energy up to 500 gigawatts. We want to ensure at least half of our energy supply is coming through clean sources and renewable sources. We are focused on deforestation and bringing down our carbon emissions intensity by the end of the decade. So to make the transition, India is focusing on electric vehicles, solar and wind energy. And we are also trying to focus on adaptation, mitigation measures. So this requires a lot of investments worth billions and billions of dollars. The writers even provide a rough estimate regarding what kind of finance is needed for India. Of course, the government will raise most of the funds, but we do need some support from the outside as well, as India is not entirely responsible for the current impact of climate change. Our historical responsibilities are almost nil, and the developed countries which are responsible for historical emissions should genuinely provide climate finance. So this should be the focus of the upcoming top 29 according to the writers. Now let's take up a practice question based on this. Why are developing countries more vulnerable to climate change? How does the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change define climate finance? Why have the figures mentioned in the recent OECD report been called into question? See, I always tell my students, when you're practicing answer writing, or eventually when you're writing answers in your mains exam as well, please spend a few seconds to read and understand and comprehend the question carefully before you start jumping into answer writing. Before you blindly start the answer, just spend 20-30 seconds to carefully read and understand, and always break down the question into sub-questions. In any mains question, in any paper, in any subject, there will be sub-parts, sub-components in each question, and your answer has to do justice to each part of the question. That's why I'm asking you to carefully break down the question into its constituents. So this is a very straightforward question. There are 3 sub-questions clearly involved over here, but in some cases there will be open-ended statements as well, which you should consider as part of the question. So once you identify the different parts, you need to ensure your answer will do justice to all the parts of the question. So here the first part is asking about why developing countries are more vulnerable. So in the introduction, you can talk about historical responsibilities and emissions, and hold the developed countries accountable and present some data to justify your argument, and point out why developing nations are more prone and vulnerable to the impact. Because of the low level of development, the high level of poverty, and the weaker adaptation mitigation measures, these countries are more prone to the impact of rising sea levels, extreme weather events and disasters which are linked with climate change. And the worst part is they haven't contributed to this climate change. Their contribution has been almost minimal. So present the data as well. The 6th assessment report says 57% of emissions have been attributed to developed countries since 1850 despite their small population, which pushes up their per capita emissions. Developed nations have very, very high per capita emissions. They have utilized most of the carbon budget that was available, leaving very little for developing countries which have very high population. So developing nations not only deal with high population, they also have serious developmental challenges. They are yet to tackle poverty, challenges in healthcare and education, and hence they need space to grow. So they can't blindly adopt clean technology, which is more expensive. The transition is very challenging for them. So they will need some continued dependency on fossil fuels for a few more decades as they make a transition. So this is why they need support in finance and technology from the developed countries which have historical responsibility on them. So present this in one paragraph. Let it be a slightly big paragraph, maybe around 8 to 9 lines, so that you provide a solid introduction along with explaining why developing countries are more vulnerable. Next, coming to the second part of your question. How does the Climate Change Convention define climate finance? I just gave you the definition. The Climate Change Convention says that any funding that goes towards adaptation, mitigation, and clean energy transition, only that is accounted as climate finance, be it at the local level or provincial level, national level or global level. So the funding which is dedicated for adaptation, mitigation measures and clean energy transition, only that is accounted for as climate finance. So provide the explanation of climate finance. And next, what is the problem with the recent OECD report? In the second part of the body, you can discuss the flawed calculation which has been adopted by OECD countries, how they have included commercial loans and other investments as well. Whereas climate finance, according to the Climate Change Convention, should only consider those investments going towards clean energy transition, adaptation and mitigation. It should only include grants given by the developed countries, by their governments, and concessional loans given by the public and private sector from developed countries. They can't include commercial loans which have high interest rate and other investments coming into the equity market. So this is the problem with the report. So please highlight that and conclude your answer by pointing out that developed countries have to provide climate finance. So again, reiterate the point, why developing countries need that financial support to make the transition to clean energy, and why they need support in technology as well for adaptation and mitigation. So that will be your conclusion, so that you maintain a consistent viewpoint throughout your answer. There is a logical flow and a structure, and you included all the required points which does justice to the given question. So that is how you build a good answer. Now let's see how many of you can write an answer based on this. Next, on the supplement page, we have another article related to climate change. This is related to the hurricane cyclone phenomena in the tropical belt, and it is mainly focused on the hurricane season in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, and what lessons does it offer for India, which is also vulnerable to the impact of tropical cyclones in the North Indian Ocean. So let's take a quick look and learn about the impact of cyclones and what challenges lie ahead for countries like India. What lessons can we draw from the cyclonic season, the hurricane season in the Atlantic, and how can we apply that in the North Indian Ocean? So that is something we need to understand. I'm sure all of you know that recently the United States was hit by a massive cyclone, right? In the North Atlantic, cyclones are also called hurricanes. The phenomena involved in cyclone formation is exactly the same across the tropical, subtropical belts. The names change from region to region. For example, towards Australia, they are called willy willies. Towards Japan, China, Philippines, it's called a typhoon. And towards the Caribbean and the east coast of US, towards Florida, it's called a hurricane. In India, we just call it cyclone, right? In the Indian Ocean, in the North Indian Ocean, and even towards East Africa, it is just called a cyclone, a tropical cyclone. But eventually, the phenomena is exactly the same. Now, if you look at the forecast that was provided for hurricanes in the North Atlantic, there was something very shocking that we have noticed. See, if you look at cyclonic activity, there is a link with the El Nino La Nina phenomena, which refers to the abnormal heating and cooling of waters in the central equatorial Pacific between Australia and Peru. Depending on whether it's a El Nino La Nina year, the cyclonic activity is also impacted around the world. Now, the general understanding was in the North Atlantic Ocean, hurricanes would be subdued, meaning you would see fewer cyclones and less intense cyclones if it is a El Nino year in the Central Pacific. In Central Pacific between Australia and Peru, if it is a El Nino season being reported, the general understanding was it would translate to lesser cyclonic activity in North Atlantic, thereby resulting in subdued hurricanes. And the opposite for La Nina. If it is La Nina in the Central Pacific, in North Atlantic, this would intensify hurricane activity. This has been the general understanding of our researchers. So last year, when we saw a El Nino year, researchers had anticipated fewer cyclones and lesser intense cyclones. But this prediction went wrong. Last year, things turned around. Even though it was a El Nino phenomena in the Central Pacific, hurricanes were extremely intense in the North Atlantic. And this year, which is La Nina year in the Central Pacific, the forecasters were predicting more intensified hurricane activity, but we are seeing the opposite throughout the current year, 2024. Even though US and Caribbean have been hit by few hurricanes like Hurricane Milton, which caused a lot of devastation in Miami, Florida, etc. Despite that, overall, the hurricane activity actually has declined this particular year in the North Atlantic, which is opposite of our traditional understanding. In a La Nina year, hurricane activity should have been more intensified, causing more cyclones and high intense cyclones. But we haven't witnessed that in this year, except for Hurricane Milton and few exceptions. So the question is climate change flipping this connection between hurricane formation in North Atlantic and the El Nino La Nina phenomena. Is our understanding of these weather systems undergoing a significant change right in front of us? Are we not able to predict and forecast these events because of the ongoing changes in the climatic and weather patterns? That is an important question being raised by this article. Since our traditional understanding is changing compared to the actual forecast, what really happens on the ground is starkly different. So this has given rise to a question whether the link between El Nino, La Nina phenomena and hurricanes in North Atlantic, is it broken or has it flipped? Has it reversed? We don't know. We have no answers in this regard. So this has lessons for India. Why? Because the general presumption was that because of climate change, we presumed that number of cyclones will also increase and intensity of cyclones will also increase. This again was a presumption based on some scientific data. But recent years' experience with cyclones around the world is showing that this is not entirely true, because number of cyclones have more or less remained the same. Please make a note. We always presume that frequency of cyclones might also go up, but data shows this hasn't really happened. The world is witnessing more or less the same number of cyclones in total on average across the world, be it North Atlantic, be it the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. In total, more or less the number of cyclones remains the same. But what has changed is the intensification. There is a significant change we are witnessing around the cyclonic grounds, where cyclones are becoming more and more intense. So this has very important lessons for North Indian Ocean. Because see, intensification is dependent on the cyclonic phenomena. If you understand how cyclones are formed, one of the important factors that contributes to formation of a cyclone is the requirement of warm sea surface temperature. You need a warm sea surface temperature to drive a constant rate of evaporation, which brings the required water vapor that fuels the cyclone and initiates the depression, the low pressure center that drags the winds from high pressure zones, creating a cyclonic vortex. So given that global warming has heated up the waters of the seas and the oceans, we are witnessing more warm sea temperatures, which is contributing to more evaporation and more water supply or moisture supply to the cyclones, which is feeding the intensification. And this intensification is happening very rapidly. Within hours, within days, a cyclone gets intensified, and many times the forecast prediction goes wrong because of this. Even though we have made a lot of progress in forecasting technology and early warning systems, which has helped in minimizing the impact of cyclones, the challenge right now is because of global warming and the rise in sea surface temperatures, we are seeing more evaporation during the cyclone months. And we are also seeing a shift in the cyclone period as well. Right? In the traditional months where cyclone used to occur, it's not occurring. But in the other months when cyclones wouldn't form, we are seeing a formation of cyclones. So the overall pattern has changed, intensification has changed, but overall the number of cyclones remains the same. So if you look at forecasting, let's say we look at this from India's perspective. India has done phenomenally well when it comes to cyclone management. Ever since the Disaster Management Act was brought out and a proactive disaster management approach was implemented, where we follow the disaster management cycle, the 3 steps: pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster. So as part of pre-disaster planning and preparedness, India has invested heavily in forecasting and early warning systems. So today, the forecasts have improved, the accuracy has gone up. IMD is able to provide quite accurate forecasts regarding the formation of a low pressure depression, be it in Bay of Bengal or in Arabian Sea. It is able to even track the cone of uncertainty. Once the cyclonic vortex is created at the low pressure depression, which we call the eye of the storm starts moving, right? And it traces a certain path before it makes landfall, before it strikes the coastline. So prior to landfall, estimating the path is a big challenge, and the range with which the estimation is provided, right? The expected path of a cyclone is what we refer to as a cone of uncertainty. Now let's assume this is the Indian subcontinent, right? Peninsular India, and let's assume there is a intense cyclone which has taken shape in Bay of Bengal. Now which direction and which path will it move towards the coastline to make landfall is the most important prediction, right? So the IMD provides an estimate. It draws a cone like this, saying this could be the range within which the cyclone would move before making landfall. So this estimation, the accuracy of this has become better and better. The cone of uncertainty has narrowed with improvement in forecasting technology, with more Doppler radars, with better satellite based forecasting, and also with supercomputing, which crunches the weather forecasting model to provide accurate estimates. We have seen a big improvement, right, around the world as well. For example, if you look at the super cyclone of 1999 in Odisha, when India was not prepared, when India didn't have adequate forecasting systems, we hardly took any precaution. There was barely any evacuations done. And as a result, 10,000 people were killed in Odisha in the super cyclone of 1999. But today, in the last 10-15 years, there are cyclones which have been of much higher intensity than the 99 super cyclone, but the death count is either in single digit or lower double digit. That is the remarkable improvement India has made thanks to its preparedness. So definitely forecasting technology has improved, the accuracy has gone up. With regard to landfall as well, we are able to provide very accurate estimates about the exact place and time where the landfall is going to occur, and accordingly the authorities will carry out the evacuation. But however, one area that we need to improve is post landfall events, because the actual disaster begins after the landfall event. Once cyclone makes landfall, right, once it strikes the continental landmass, that is when the high speed winds, torrential rains, and even the coastal surge is witnessed. High tides will crash into the coastline with a towering height of anywhere between 10 to 25 feet, almost like a mini tsunami. It brings torrential rain across the coastal plain and even in the interior parts of the country. It brings extremely high speed winds, and this is what can damage infrastructure. The high speed winds and torrential rain can lead to flooding. It can cause landslides, it can uproot infrastructure, houses, property, causing widespread damage and destruction, leading to loss of lives as well. So post landfall prediction is something that needs to improve. Not just in India, around the world, we are not able to bring out hyper local predictions. The assessments, the early warnings, they can't just focus on the overall path a cyclone is taking or where exactly landfall will happen, but it should get even more specific. It should be customized to every single village and city in the path so that accurate real-time estimates can be provided. Because due to the warmer seas today, due to global warming, cyclones are intensifying very quickly and rapidly. And today the systems are not able to provide good, accurate forecasts when sudden intensification is happening. For example, just few days back, Tamil Nadu was on cyclone alert, right? Those from South India would have experienced the weather condition as a result of this cyclone. And Chennai was put on high alert. The IMD, along with the disaster management authorities, put Chennai on a massive high alert as they were expecting large scale flooding to occur. But however, this did not happen because the cyclone, which not only intensified, all of a sudden, it changed its path as well, and it landed somewhere north of Chennai. So what happens is that when the forecast is missing the accuracy, right, of course it will increase the risk for the actual affected area which was not prepared for this. And in places like Chennai, where the warning became a dud, people could become complacent next time. They may not take the warning seriously, right? So for few times when you put a place on high alert and nothing happens, eventually that brings in complacency, a sense of carelessness. And other places which are actually getting affected, they wouldn't have got adequate notice to prepare, to evacuate. So this is where we need to focus on hyper local alerts in real time. That is what the writer is talking about. So we should draw lessons from what's happening in the North Atlantic. There is a clear evidence that number of cyclones has not really gone up, but cyclones are intensifying more rapidly. This is a result of global warming because of warmer sea, which contributes the moisture needed to fuel the cyclone. So we are able to predict landfall. We have narrowed the cone of uncertainty, the path through which the cyclone is moving, but we are not able to provide very specific local forecasts and alerts. So unless and until we develop those capabilities to provide hyper local early warnings, then we won't be able to deal with the impact of climate change and extreme weather events. So that is the key lesson that we draw from this article. So please take up this question. What do the Atlantic Ocean hurricane forecasts foretell for India? So use the points I've discussed and the structure and approach I explained in the previous question and try to write an answer for this question. Now coming to the next article on page 6, Shashi Tharoor has written a wonderful article about the rise of China, the ongoing US-China competition and rivalry, and where does this leave India? So let's examine this article quickly. Shashi Tharoor talks about the so-called Cold War 2.0, the second edition of the Cold War as experts call it, which has begun between US and China. This is a reference to the intense economic, political and geopolitical rivalry which has begun between the two major powers, US and China. So this reminds the writer of the original Cold War that began after the World War from 1940s, late 1940s to 1991, when the world was divided between two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union. The US was aligned with all the other Western powers and was championing democracy and capitalism. So there was a clear ideological motive in the previous version of the Cold War. Whereas the Soviet Union had brought together all the communist, socialist states and was championing communism and socialism, forming the Eastern Bloc. So it's based on this experience of the first Cold War that experts say that the current rivalry competition between US-China is a second version of the Cold War. But Shashi Tharoor doesn't agree with this. Shashi Tharoor says it is incorrect to label the current rivalry competition between US-China as a Cold War. And I'll explain why. If you look at the first Cold War between US and Soviet Union, if you look at the rivalries, the kind of competition they faced, it was a clear division between the two sides. Both of them were not dependent on each other. The US was not dependent on Soviet Union was not dependent on the US. The rivalry, the conflict, the tensions that broke out between them was extremely intense. For example, they got into a space race. They got into a nuclear arms race. They started building up their nuclear warheads, expanding their space program just to prove a point. And as I said, this was more of an ideological conflict. There was a clear ideological motive involved, where Soviet Union was championing communism and socialism and building allies. The West was championing democracy and capitalism and forming their own allies and even forming military alliances like NATO, the Warsaw Pact, etc. And also more importantly, they were actively involved in covert warfare, targeting each other, undermining each other, conducting sabotage against each other. The CIA and KGB, they were both notoriously targeting each other, going to any extent to harm the other country. This was the nature of the Cold War rivalry between the then superpowers. They divided the world into power blocks, right? Now, if you compare this with the current rivalry and competition with US and China, you will find a big difference. One big difference is that US and China are not disconnected. They are not isolated from each other. In fact, they are more connected than ever. If you look at US and Soviet Union, they were completely disconnected. American economy was never dependent on Soviet economy. Soviet economy was never dependent on American economy. Their societies were not connected. Their people were not connected. They did not live in a globalized world. So that is when it was appropriate to call this a Cold War, as there was a clear divide between the two sides. But Shashi Tharoor says you can't call the current rivalry competition between US-China as a Cold War because they are dependent on each other. They are connected and they are dependent. And I think this is a very interesting, very important observation. Because see, after the Soviet Union disintegrated and collapsed in 1991, for the next 2 decades, we entered a unipolar world where US emerged as the sole superpower. It dominated global geopolitics until the rise of China, which became evident since the 2008-2009 global economic crisis. With the global recession that started from the US markets, we saw a clear rise of China as not just an emerging power, but as a global power, which could pose a direct challenge and a threat to American dominance. So we have definitely entered a bipolar world again, where two power centers have emerged, but it is nothing like the previous Cold War, where the world was segregated, divided, where Soviet Union, US were not connected and dependent on each other. So they could afford to target each other and even wage major covert wars, going to any extent to harm the other side and forming alliances and military clubs. But we haven't seen anything of that sort between US and China. Of course, they are rivals, they are in competition. They do target each other covertly, they do have covert operations going on against each other, but there is no clear indication of this kind of isolation and disconnect between the two sides. Because in a globalized world, see, from 1990s, the world moved towards globalization, an interconnected economy. And today, believe it or not, US is the biggest investor in China. Over the last many years, US has been the biggest investor in the Chinese economy. In fact, if China could become a manufacturing powerhouse, it was largely because a communist state adapted capitalism. So China doesn't really care about promoting communism everywhere in the world, unlike Soviet Union. Soviet Union was very eager to promote communism, just like West was promoting democracy. But China doesn't care about this. China is not really interested in promoting communism. It has even adopted its own version of capitalism and attracting investments from US and West, which is what turned China into the manufacturing powerhouse it is today. And again, believe it or not, China is the biggest owner of US Treasury bonds. China holds the largest quantum of US Treasury bonds, thereby giving China tremendous influence on the US markets, on the US dollar as well. So both sides are dependent, connected to each other. China could dominate the supply chains by becoming a manufacturing hub, mainly due to American assistance, as American companies shifted manufacturing to China in the 80s and 90s. That is what powered the rise of China in the first place. So there is a lot of dependency on both sides. Both sides are equally dependent on each other. For example, look at the tourist flow, the student flow between the two sides. If you look at the foreign student diaspora in the US, one of the biggest student community would be the Chinese students. If you look at the tourist flow as well, right? So there is a lot of interconnectedness, dependency. It's not that they are disconnected and isolated, but definitely there is a rivalry. There is a competition. So it is not appropriate to call this Cold War 2.0 according to Shashi Tharoor. Instead, he says that this is more of a cold competition. It's a competitive rivalry which is being seen. Definitely they are competing for influence, they're competing for resources, they're competing for dominance. There's no doubt about it. But it's not your traditional Cold War as we saw between US and Soviet Union. There is a clear distinction. So Shashi Tharoor says that Let's not call it Cold War 2.0, which is inappropriate and incorrect. And let's refer to this as more of a cold competition, a competitive rivalry between the two major powers. Now, the United States is well aware that China has already emerged as the leading power of the Indo-Pacific region. In global geopolitics, we have seen a big shift from the Atlantic, which was the focal point from 1940s to 1990s. This is where the then Cold War was centered. The then Cold War rivalry was centered primarily around the Atlantic, as all the major powers were located here in and around the Atlantic. But today this has shifted towards Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is the current focus of the global economy and global geopolitics. This is where major powers like India, Japan, Australia and others are located, along with China. So Indo-Pacific is the current focus in global geopolitics, and the US is well aware of China's aggression and expansionism. Right? So this is where the US is mindful of the military rise of China. Estimates show that China might even overtake the American military might very soon. In fact, if you look at the PLA Navy, it has already procured more warships than the US Navy. It's well on its path to have even more submarines, especially nuclear powered submarines and warships and aircraft carriers, eventually more than the US. The PLA Air Force as well is on a modernization drive, and very soon it is expected to overtake the capabilities of US Air Force. So military strength and capabilities does play a critical role. Every indication shows that China is all set to overtake the US, which might pose a significant threat to American military dominance. Because your geopolitical economic dominance comes from your military dominance. China understands this very well, and even though China hasn't really formed any sort of military clubs or alliances, it is definitely spreading its influence through initiatives like Belt and Road Initiative. It is getting hold of strategic projects which can serve a military purpose, especially in the Indo-Pacific. It is championing influence operations around the world to gain influence with other countries. It's building transactional relationships, either attracting countries with its economic power or threatening countries with its military and economic power. So this is where India gets caught in between US and China. India doesn't want any hostility with China, but China has been aggressive, and as you know, since 2020, we are locked in a tense standoff in Ladakh, and at some places in Ladakh, the issue is yet to be resolved. So many believe that this was China's retaliation as well against India, given India's growing relations with United States and the West. India has embraced the US. US sees India as a counterbalance to China in the Indo-Pacific. US believes a democratic India and a large economy and a military power like India can be the perfect counter to a communist, aggressive China. The US has even supplied advanced weaponry to India to modernize Indian armed forces. We have very close military, strategic and even diplomatic and economic relations. So China sees India as an American ally, but India denies that. As India follows an independent foreign policy, we are not allies of anyone. But China doesn't look at it that way. It looks at India as an ally of US and its other allies. So groupings like Quad, the quadrilateral, and other minilaterals which are formed in the region like Squad, which are led by US and includes countries like Japan, Australia, and of course India, which is part of the Quad. This offers India an opportunity where we can collaborate with these like-minded democracies to counter Chinese aggression and enforce rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, to ensure that Indo-Pacific is kept free and open. Because China is threatening free and open Indo-Pacific region. It's threatening freedom of navigation, disrupting the movement of vessels and aircraft by claiming the territory in violation of UN conventions. So a grouping like the Quad can help India to align with US, Japan and Australia to bring that counter pressure on China and ensure that rules-based order and international rules are maintained in the Indo-Pacific. But however, India should be careful as well. Shashi Tharoor says that this is not a traditional Cold War as we saw between US and Soviet Union. So it would be inappropriate on India's part to blindly align with Quad countries or especially US, because that could be misconstrued by China. Don't forget, India is the only country amongst the Quad which shares a land border, that too a disputed land border with China. If China were to retaliate against the Quad, most likely it will be against India by putting pressure at the disputed Himalayan border. That's what we are seeing happening in Ladakh. So keeping this in mind, India should avoid a direct confrontation or hostility with China, given that China is much superior to India in terms of its economic and military strength. India should of course work with Quad to maintain the diplomatic pressure, but we shouldn't be seen as part of any military clubs or alliances or an attempt to contain or counter China. We shouldn't be adding to the competition and rivalry that exists between them. So this is a warning that Shashi Tharoor is providing to India. We should read this correctly. We should not read this as a Cold War where the two powers are disconnected from each other. They're connected, they're dependent on each other. They are aware that they can't afford a conflict between them. So given that, it's important that India maintains its own distance from the rivalry of US and China. We should not get involved. We should not become a mere pawn between US and China. We should maintain an independent foreign policy as we always have. We should work with US and Quad and ensure that we maintain the diplomatic pressure on Chinese aggression. At the same time, we should make it clear to China that we are not containing the country, we are not part of any military alliance. We should try to maintain our independent ties with China, resolve our boundary issues and maintain a cordial relationship. So that is where the interest of India lies. There should be no increase in hostility between India and China. At the same time, we shouldn't get caught between US-China rivalry. So this is what Shashi Tharoor indicates in this article. Next, on the front page, we have an update with regard to internal security, a very disturbing development from Kashmir. Yesterday in Kashmir, there was a major terror attack where militants have targeted non-local workers again. This has been a persistent problem as far as Kashmir insurgency and terrorism is concerned, especially since the special status of J&K was revoked and Article 370 was nullified and Article 35A, which provided special provisions to the people of J&K, was made inoperational. Since then, there has been an increase in attacks on the outsiders or the non-locals, especially migrant workers from Punjab, UP, Bihar. They have been targeted. See, under Article 35A, those who were domiciled in J&K, they enjoyed few special privileges. Only they could buy the land, they had voting powers, they enjoyed privileges like special reservation as well, etc. But now with the special status being revoked and Article 35A being removed, even outsiders, essentially any Indian from any part of the country, will enjoy the same rights. They could buy land, they will get voting powers if they fulfill the domicile requirement, and they'll be eligible for other government benefits, just like the locals. So this has led to targeted attempts to attack outsiders, outside workers, migrant workers. We had seen a similar trend in 1990s and early 2000 as well, when Kashmir militancy was at its peak with full backing from Pakistan, where Pakistan was giving state support to the separatist and terrorist groups. We had seen targeted attacks on outsiders and as well as on religious minorities like Kashmiri Pandits. So in some way, we are seeing a return of that. In recent years, in the last 4 years, there have been few attacks on religious minorities as well, especially towards the Jammu region. We have seen a major uptick in terrorism. The Jammu region, which had relatively become free from insurgency, right? It was very badly affected in 1990s, but after that, insurgency had gone down. But in last 2-3 years, we are seeing a major uptick in violence in the Jammu region as well. And in Kashmir, there are targeted attacks on migrant workers, the outsiders, and as well as on religious minorities. So this is a major cause for concern. And this attack, which has happened yesterday, where 6 migrant workers with a local doctor were killed, total of 7 people were killed. This attack took place in a strategic location. It took place near the Z-More tunnel, the Z-More tunnel or Z-More tunnel, which is coming up in the Ganderbal region. So please pay attention to this point as well, right? There could be a possible prelims question on the strategic Z-More tunnel which is being built on the Srinagar-Leh highway. NH1 is a strategic critical highway linking Srinagar with Leh, Kashmir with Ladakh, and this route has been a challenging route because of the Himalayan terrain, especially near popular tourist locations like Sonamarg. The movement of vehicles was getting slowed down because of the ups and curves. So a major tunnel project has been taken up which serves an economic purpose and a strategic purpose. So the Zimor tunnel in the Ganderbal region is where the attack has happened, where construction workers from other states were working on the project, right? This is where the attack has happened, where workers from Punjab, Bihar have been targeted. It's called the Zimor tunnel because the shape of the tunnel, the shape of the road is almost like a Z, like the letter Z. That's why it's called the Zimor tunnel. It connects Srinagar with Sonamarg. It will be a big boost to tourism and economic activities in the region. It will further link with Kargil, Dras Batalik, and even it will benefit the Amarnath pilgrimage, a sacred Hindu pilgrimage, and will further improve connectivity with Leh. The route, which would take several hours before, can now be completed in a very short time. Adjacent to it, there is another strategic tunnel coming up at the Zojila Pass that you see over here, which is the Zojila tunnel. So there are two strategic tunnels being built. They serve a very important military purpose as well, because this route from Srinagar to Leh would often get blocked because of heavy snowfall and avalanches during winter. This was affecting the locals, the tourists, and more importantly, it would affect the military movement of the army. Army would struggle to move troops and equipment to the front line with Pakistan and China. Now, because of these tunnels which are getting built, the Zojila tunnel and Zimor tunnel, the connectivity would become all weather. This would give all weather connectivity even during the winter months, thus serving a geostrategic purpose along with an economic purpose. Now let's take a quick look at the prelims section. We have a couple of important articles and then we can wrap up the session for today. On page 12, we have an article referring to the Malabar Naval Exercise. India has hosted the latest edition of Malabar Naval Exercise in the Bay of Bengal. The sea operations were carried out in the Bay of Bengal and the port-based exercise was carried out in Visakhapatnam. Malabar is one of the most important military exercises involving the Quad countries. The Quad members, that is India, Australia, Japan and United States, they are part of this multilateral naval exercise. But however, India has made it very, very clear that Malabar is not the military arm of the Quad. Even though the same countries are part of both, India has tried to create a distinction in order to not antagonize China unnecessarily. See, if you look at the history of Malabar, it was started in 1992 as a bilateral naval exercise just between India and US. Only Indian Navy and US Navy would participate in this bilateral exercise from 1992. In 2007, the then Manmohan Singh government made an attempt to expand this exercise into a multilateral exercise by inviting Japan, Australia and even Singapore. India widened the scope of Malabar by bringing Japan, Australia and Singapore, which were like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. But this move by India was countered by China. China was very furious and angry at India for organizing this exercise and turning it into multilateral exercise. And China labeled this as an attempt to contain the rise and growth of China. China saw this as a military threat. So following this objection from China, India reverted the exercise back to the bilateral format because we didn't want any unnecessary hostilities with China, because back in 2007, India-China relations were developing quite well. We were actually getting quite closer and even discussing the boundary issue as well. So to avoid any unnecessary complication, India reverted back to the bilateral exercise. We stopped inviting Japan, Australia and Singapore. So for many years, it continued as a bilateral naval exercise. But in 2014, as China had already gotten more aggressive against India, carrying out multiple border incursions and stepping up the boundary issues, India decided to escalate and invite Japan, because even China, Japan had increased their tensions over their maritime dispute. Given the close strategic ties between India and Japan, which had flourished by then, India invited Japan and turned Malabar into a trilateral naval exercise in 2014. Then in 2020, after the Ladakh clashes, after China instigated India again through Ladakh incursions, India decided to bring Australia back into Malabar, and we invited Australia as well permanently into Malabar exercise. So that is how it was restored into the multilateral format, and since 2020, all the 4 navies are actively participating in this naval exercise. But we have taken a lot of care to ensure that Malabar is seen as a standalone naval exercise which is not connected to the Quad grouping. According to India, Quad is just an informal diplomatic grouping. Quad is meant to stabilize Indo-Pacific, to maintain rules-based order. According to India, Quad has no military purpose, and Malabar is just a military exercise to build coordination between like-minded navies. So India has maintained that distinction, but China sees Quad as Asian NATO, primarily because the very same countries participate in a joint military exercise, that is Malabar exercise. Australia also hosts a similar exercise, a multilateral exercise called Exercise Kakadu. Even this was in the news recently. Around 30 countries participate in this, including India. So please make a note. This could be asked in a prelims question. Australia hosts the Kakadu naval exercise, where it invites close to 25 to 30 countries, and India is also one of the participants. So the Malabar exercise, which is currently ongoing in Bay of Bengal, comes immediately after Exercise Kakadu, which was recently hosted by Australia. Now coming to the last article for today. On the supplement page, the Hindu carries this spectacular image of Atlantic spotted dolphins, which are found in the Atlantic Ocean. This image has been captured in one beautiful location, Ponta Delgada, which is in the São Miguel Island of the Azores archipelago, which belongs to Portugal. Now, why is this in news? It's in news because Portugal has taken a landmark step. See, the European country of Portugal, which you can see in the map over here, it has 2 major island groups in the Atlantic. One is Madeira over here, which is the birthplace of Cristiano Ronaldo as well, right? And a little away from there, you have another group of islands, the Azores group of islands. Both the group of islands are spectacular group of islands. They are part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, and they are entirely formed because of the undersea volcanic activity. It's entirely formed as a result of intense volcanic activity in the region across the mid-Atlantic ridge. So these islands are blessed with tremendous biodiversity as well, very unique biodiversity, especially Azores. It is made up of a group of islands, that's why it's part of this archipelago. And the local administration here, which has its own regional autonomy, they have declared one of the world's largest marine protected areas. That is why the Azores is in news. The entire region of Azores archipelago in the Atlantic, in the mid-Atlantic ridge, has been declared as a marine protected area, and this is in line with Convention on Biological Diversity and the goals that countries have adopted under Convention on Biological Diversity. See, in the map you can see Ponta Delgada over here at São Miguel, which is one of the islands of Azores. So there are multiple islands present here, which is a very important biodiversity hotspot. So a large area of around 3 lakh square kilometers has been notified by the regional autonomous government of Azores with the Portuguese government as a large marine protected area. This is the largest protected area in the Atlantic. In the North Atlantic, this would be the largest marine protected area, and across the world as well, it would be one of the largest marine protected areas. Now, this is in line with the targets that countries have adopted under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. As part of Convention on Biological Diversity, a couple of years ago, at the Kunming-Montreal Summit, the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, which provides for target number 3, known as 30 by 30. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the 30 by 30 target, which is part of global biodiversity framework. So under 30 by 30, the countries have agreed to protect 30% of land area, 30% of the seas by 2030. By the end of the decade, the goal is to ensure 30% of land area is declared as protected through national parks, sanctuaries, biosphere reserves, etc. Similarly, 30% of the seas should be declared as marine protected areas. That is the goal that countries have adopted to protect biodiversity by the end of the decade. So under the 30 by 30 framework, target number 3 deals with establishment of large marine protected areas. It's in line with this commitment that Portugal, along with the local autonomous government in Azores, they have declared one of the largest marine protected area in the North Atlantic. This is the largest marine protected area in the North Atlantic, and also it would be one of the largest across the world. So that is what you need to note. You should be familiar with the location. There could be map based or geography based questions, or a question on the 30 by 30 target of global biodiversity framework. So on this note, I would like to complete my discussion. I hope you have understood everything. If you like the session, do support us with your likes and comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So that is it for today. Let's catch up tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.